Hello, everyone. This is the Ravens Librarian. Discussing episode 4 of the One Piece live action adaptation. And mentioned in previous parts, I'll be talking about it mostly from a fan perspective, just noticing the changes, the details that I caught. I'll be trying to keep any and all comments regarding future plots of the live action episodes that come after in the adaptation, or things that happen after the series, that the show may or may not be making references to. I'll be keeping that to a 0 whenever possible. If I make any mention, I apologize. This is just aimed at talking about what actually occurred in the episode and how it contrasts to its adaptation, to the source it's adapting. So, I may mention things out of order, but based on what already has been discussed, not anything after. Anyway, in regards to episode 4, mention a list of things that I had not noticed were a thing until this episode. So, first, the logo. Every episode seems to start with the same pirate logo, but it adds a pirate logo based on the series. So, in one episode, I think it was episode 2, they used the buggy logo. I didn't mention that, but I did notice it. I did not notice which one they used in the third logo. I'm gonna have to go back and check. And in this episode's logo, it was Zoro's pirate logo, based on the fact that in this episode was where they decided to insert his backstory with Kuina. Interesting choice to use in this part, but it makes sense in the context of the episode, since they had to nerf him out in the last episode by catching him off guard with Kuro. So tossing him in the well and giving him a little time to self-reflect as he's getting himself out of the well was a good enough place to insert the flashback. Also, it helps fill out the episode so they don't stretch out what's happening, but also give the storyline of Kuro and Kuina and Usopp time to pay off in this episode. That can often come off an issue, obviously, when you need to make sure that the episode has enough content for its own and you're not risking stretching it out to another episode. In the case of what they did with the Marines, I'll admit, I was very lost as to what the Marines were going to contribute, and it genuinely did not occur to me until this episode that having Helmeppo here could pay off in a big way if he ended up discovering that Kuro was in fact here the whole time, because that would have ended up, completely shattering his perception of his father, which is something that does happen eventually in the original version and may happen here, but just takes a bit longer, and likely that's the point. But it's kind of funny that basically without him realizing, he's kind of repeating the cycle from his dad. Referring to Kuro, it's this episode. If I noticed in the last episode, this episode definitely leans very hard on the horror aspect of his personality. Having the best addition in this live action version, as over the top as it is, fits perfectly with the setting. And it's the security system for the mansion. Just the fact, the goofy part is the fact that it works by using a kind of a turn wheel, like a pirate ship. But just the fact that they have this super advanced security system, and it conveniently dims all the lights inside the mansion, so it just happens to perfectly fit the scary tone that the bad guy wants to match. Jokes, but for real, I think that's a great addition. I like that they found a way to justify having at least his two quote-unquote best fighters from the Black Cat Pirates be in this version, so we could have an actual fight for not just Luffy, so he gets to fight, but then we gave Zoro the other fight with the other two. That's especially good because it maintains the fact of giving Zoro chances to show off his combat skills, and in this case, more leaning towards the choreographed acrobatic side of it. And it's a nice contrast to like what you expect, especially with the comparison to Luffy's fights, which while still having sort of like that, spectator choreographed type, leans more into cool moments and cool effects type of fight. Like how Luffy is mostly just trying to punch Kuro right in the face. Kuro just keeps dodging. So until when he finally manages to like catch him off guard. And good that they managed to keep Kuro's like sort of like in this version, it's sort of like the unspoken motivation, because here you can just attribute it to just greed and scheming, but like it maintains his motivation, which is that his biggest gripe with being a pirate wasn't all the evil he had to do or all the harm he caused, and it wasn't even like the risk to him. The thing that stuck to him, the thing that bothered him about being a pirate, was the fact that even after he completed all his work, he'd still get hunted. And that's like the main contrast that's meant to be between him and Luffy. It's supposed to be there with Usopp to a similar extent, but definitely can say that Usopp, the character, the version, the actor portraying him, and the character as portrayed is good. But I definitely think this version of the presentation of the arc definitely falls short in giving him important things to do. So his main drive just ends up being trying to get the Marines to help and failing, and trying to keep name escapes me. Gaia? I hope I'm saying her name right. Trying to keep her safe. And he does that right. He has Nami's help. And say like the coolest moment he could have gotten was when he fired the slingshot at Kuro. And he dodged it, which is fine. Just more the case that it's not so much that he didn't beat him or anything like that. I just mean that he doesn't have like the same gravitas moments that you can argue he has in the other version of Zero Village. And obvious, but equally important, which I think is the point, is that eventually he's gonna have to prove his mettle, which obviously that's the whole point of future storylines. So I can obviously reserve judgment for as the story moves forward. I just want to acknowledge that in my opinion, I might be overthinking it, but I'd say this storyline for him falls short in giving him enough stuff to do in his story. It does a good job of establishing him. I just think it could have done a better job of in connecting him and the storyline. Anyway, him and the confrontation with Kobe was pretty straightforward. It's about what you'd expect was going to happen. Still waiting to see how it, carries forward in the next parts. But it still works because it matches sort of the problem that Kobe's going to be facing a lot as in his journey, which is finding how to do the right thing in a world that consistently tells him that good and bad are defined exclusively by factions. And in a way you can argue that's why he did it, why people don't really notice Kuro, despite how inarguably shady he's still being even as the butler. It's just because there's an automatic categorization when it comes to pirates. So it's like pirates are scum, and there's sort of like an obvious stereotypical assumption that leans into that, and it's something that Kuro obviously was doing an attempt to mask. Like I said, might be overthinking it, but I do think it carries with how the Straw Hats actually joke about that in their development, like how make a flag, it's like flag isn't scary. Like the assumptions are always that pirates have to act a certain way, and Luffy's problem, quote unquote, is the assumption that he's not pirating right, when in reality it's everyone else who's got sort of the wrong obsession with what being a pirate is supposed to be like. And again, obviously, you can also argue that it's because Luffy's aiming for an ideal where most pirates are criminals who are more either A, desperate, or B, motivated by shallow things like greed and petty violence. Whereas Luffy's a kid basically following in the footsteps of some random dude he met on a ship that saved his life. And that's all part of like the in-world characterization of the character. Liberated the area just by having Zoro one-shot everything. The still nice, great touch at the end. They included the reference to him making the flag. So they included his. That might have been the one in the third episode. Again, I genuinely don't remember. We'll see what they put in the next one. As leaning into the Kuro horror aesthetic. Like, it was a cool, again, leaning into that instead of a battle on the cliffside with the Syrup Village thing in danger. Here it's just the people in the mansion, but also the mansion itself leans into the scare factor. Lights get dim, the whole place is cramped. They end up going to the West Wing, which is abandoned, so there's a lot of, fits into the scary aesthetic. I'd say, as with the start, the thing that might, over time, it might depend on the latter fights, which obviously we're building up to, but it's where Zoro's fights will boil down to how well they can show off his skills with the sword, so how good the choreographer is. Again, I'm not a good judge of that, so I just think it looks cool. Take that for what you will. With Luffy, with battles, it's the case of A, how good the CGI is, which, it works obviously well enough during night, don't overthink it, but obviously it's definitely not like the most convincing thing on the planet. But also the second half is less obviously tied into the limitations of the CGI, and it's just how are they able to, how much can they get away with the CGI to do stunts for the fight. In the original version, in the original version, manga and anime, he beats Kuro by constantly, outwitting his blitz, and then finally getting him to lunge an attack at a rock, grabbing the rock, and then slamming his face right into it. That's obviously very cool. It's also A, very over the top, and B, in that very hard to pull off convincingly in live action. So instead, they use an actual move Luffy does have, so consistency, it's accurate to the character, I'm down, and one that, would still work, which is, the headbutt, which is very satisfying, again, in accepting the fact that, can go into this expecting neither the extreme over-the-top attacks that you would get in the anime, nor the, quote-unquote, visceral, I guess realism, for lack of a better word. Even that sounds, wrong. But hopefully you understand. It's like the convincing nature of it in manga form, at least for me. Like, obviously, when everything fits into one style, artistic format, and it's like it all fits in. So as long as the person knows how to convey it well, it looks realistic, or it looks the way it needs to look. Versus the problem of having to use CGI is that it, by its nature, is to some extent going to clash with how real everything else looks, because it's technically everything else is, practical effects. Once again, that's why with the Zoro fights, it's all down to choreography, because it actually does look real, because it's all physical. It's just a matter of whether or not it looks cool or engaging or, action heavy. Whereas with Luffy, the danger is just that it's gonna look too fake, so it's goofy, or it's too short because they're limited by how often they can use CGI, that, it's very fast, quick, and so you don't really get enough time to feel the momentum of his fights. And that's probably like the biggest shortcoming with the Kuro fight. Whereas like with the buggy fight, I'd actually say that fight lasted about as well as it needed to. And if anything, the only problem there is when it's two characters who are relying heavily on the special effects. It's just a matter of how convincing one fake attack is going off against another fake attack. In all of this, it might be very defeatist to just round it up that way, but that is how I see it. Back to the sets look good, the character costumes look good, even the ones with the fake tattoos. I like that they actually, with at least one of them, actually tried to put on the costume to match how he looks in the other versions. That was a nice effort. It was funny with the other one, that's the maid, the one that was the maid. Even though she didn't really care for the role, she still went around fighting with a broom as a stick weapon. That was an interesting touch where it's like, she still had a sword, but she also used the broom. I found it interesting that she seemed to... I don't know if that was just meant to be convenient, like she could just walk around and fake it, or if that was hinting at the fact that she had used the broom for so long, she'd actually gotten used to using it well. Also the reference, which is in character, I mean, it was mentioned in the other episode, but, you know, Luffy drinking the whole container filled with poison without realizing it. Only to then, you know, for the, you know, compared to other people who would have dropped dead, you know, he walked that off pretty well. And so it's already leaning into the absurdity of his character. Which obviously, whether it's, you decide whether it's down to his devil fruit or whether it's just he's weird that way. And that's something that the show itself, like, does acknowledge. Like, sometimes it's this rubber thing that makes it weird, and then sometimes it's like, nah, this Luffy's just a weird kid. I think I mentioned most of what I wanted to talk about. I guess I could talk about the flashback, but that wasn't really anything that big. Like, there's like minor things, you know, like a diehard fan can get too, you know, hung up on depending on how you interpret or / how you're meant to interpret parts of the characterization. The aspects of, you know, Zoro wanting to be a swordsman, the drive towards it, his conviction, how his dynamic with Kuina paid off. Whether or not that's gonna come forward in any meaningful way in the later events. Again, we'll talk about it here until it happens in the live action. But if you know, you know, and that's what I'm referencing. Like, as with everything else, as I've repeated to ad nauseum in the other videos, the idea that to some extent the live action has to tone down personalities just for the sake of making them seem more real. A bit, you know, the contrast sometimes where animation and comic books and manga lets you get away with more extreme personalities just because it all kind of blends well in that format, versus live action where you need to have a physical character kind of emote these, and too much reaction may cause the wrong kind of response from the audience. Like, this guy smiles too much, this guy screams too much, this guy looks too weird, so on and so forth. And so it's a thing to eventually keep note of. It's like how often the characters kind of have fairly restrained reactions, how much of that is a conscious choice because of the limitation of the medium, and how much of it is just a desire to, like, change the way the character gets portrayed. But despite my kind of sort of rambling statements, I kind of think it might be obvious or not, and then I don't say it, so it probably isn't. I am enjoying it so far, but obviously I'm looking at it a lot when talking about it, more from how it's being adapted instead of just how it is. That's unfortunately something I eventually need to see someone coming at this from a much more broad perspective. Whether or not this actually works on its own, instead of just constantly, you know, flipping back and forth between, oh, that's different. Which is a valid way of looking at it, but it's also the only one I got, so kind of hard to judge it fairly at that point. But anyway, that was part 4. See you all in the next one when I discuss episode 5. If you're interested, hope to see you all there.